From the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right.
Okay.
I'm Emilye Crosby with the Southern Oral History Program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I'm conducting this oral history as part of the Civil Rights History Project, an undertaking of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture and the American Folklife Center in the Library of Congress. Today is May 28th, and we are here at Mrs. Linda Fuller Degelmann and at her home in Americus, Georgia. And I'm here also with John Bishop, and we're really pleased to be with you today.
Well, thank you, Emily. It's a pleasure to be here with you and John.
Great. I was wondering if you could start by telling us a little bit about your family and background growing up in Alabama. Is that?
Yes. I was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1941, and that happened to be a phenomenal year when the atom bomb was used, in Japan. So, of course, I was unaware of that at that time. But my father, as a businessman, graduate of the University of Alabama, thought that it would be good for him to become active in the Army. I think actually that was the day. Those were the days when reserve units were called into active duty. And he didn't go overseas, but he was assigned to the procurement office for the Army in Philadelphia. So when I was still a toddler, we moved to Philadelphia for a couple of years. When the war was over, we moved back to Alabama and settled in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And that's where I was raised until I married in 1959.
Did your father continue to work in business?
He did. After the war, he and my mother started a business in downtown Tuscaloosa called Caldwell Electric Company. It was right on Broad Street. And so I became very familiar with all kinds of appliances. I think we were the first ones in town, in the city, to have a dishwasher. And maybe one of the first televisions, with the big antennas on top of our house. So they were very engaged in business while I was growing up in school. I have one older sister. And one thing that was real sharp in my memory about my dad's business related to the Southern culture at that time was he had a repair shop down in the basement of the store. And one of the guys was a black man, and I think he was mostly involved in delivering appliances that were sold. My dad and Mom would have an annual picnic cookout at their house every year, and he never would be invited. And I remember wondering about that. Why was not he included? And of course, I went to segregated schools, and there was just no question about whether they should be integrated. It's just the way things were. Being a university town, I think the University of Alabama, I think we were exposed to more integrated situations, although it was after I married that the university was actually integrated. And
you said you remember wondering why this one employee wasn't ever invited or wasn't at the picnics. Did you ever ask your parents, or do you know why you thought about that?
I think I did bring it up, but it was just sort of dismissed. I don't remember a specific answer.
Yeah. Do you remember, I mean, other than that, which is really interesting, do you remember sort of when you first began to think about race and sort of understand the separation and the hierarchies that existed?
Well, actually, I think it was after I married. I married, like I said, I married in 1959. And my husband, Millard, had been very active in youth work in his church. And often there would be like a conference, a youth conference, up in the north somewhere. And when he would go up there, he became aware of some differences. Specifically, he remembered being greeted by a black woman, you know, and he thought, wow, that was pretty interesting, you know. So he was at the conference with black people, and he got a different perspective outside of his upbringing, which was on the Georgia-Alabama border around West Point, Georgia. So he became aware of some transitions that were taking place. And so I picked up an awareness from him. We talked about, you know, how things were segregated, and we tried to reach out to black people whenever we had an opportunity to. And I began to realize, hey, they are just people like me, and it was mostly in a church setting.
So I've got a couple of questions about that. So do you remember things like the Brown decision or the Montgomery bus boycott? I guess you would have been in like high school or maybe even a little younger for those.
You know, right after Millard and I married, we moved to Montgomery.
Yeah.
And he and a fellow law student had gone in business while they were in law school, and they set up law practice in Montgomery. I attended Huntingdon College, which was, I think, all white at that time. But then things were occurring like the bus boycott because while I was in school, I also had children, and I needed someone to come to the house to keep the children. And so I always had to go into town to pick up the lady. Of course, because the buses, she wouldn't ride the bus. And it was an inconvenience, but yet, here again, I just accepted it as the way things were.
How that worked, yeah.
Yeah, and then there was the Selma to Montgomery to March. Actually, let me back up. The next conflict in Montgomery were the Freedom Rides. And Millard and Morris Dees actually went down to the bus station out of curiosity just to see what would happen when some of those buses came in. And they were shocked at how people were beat up as soon as they stepped off the bus. Well, yeah, there may have been several different Freedom Rides that came into Montgomery, but this particular one, I can remember how they were just shocked at how brutally people were beat up. And they began to think, hey, something's wrong with this picture here. This is terrible. You know, both of them grew up in the church, and, you know, they knew about brotherly love, and times were already beginning to change, thoughts of equality and justice and that kind of thing. But what they witnessed just made their minds shift 180 degrees. And whereas they had been sort of part of the Klan, they had been in politics in law school and had spoken on behalf of the man running for lieutenant governor. And they went to Klan rallies to speak on behalf of McDonnell Gallion. They never were members of the Klan, but they were actually sort of members on the side because they received the issues of what was called the Fiery Cross. That was a publication. I don't know how widespread it was. It may have been just Alabama Klan that published it, but they, in fact, they had represented a man that, I've forgotten exactly what the case was, but they had represented a member of the Klan for some kind of legal action. And they called him into their office. Apparently he was one of the leaders. And they told him that they wanted to cancel their subscription to the Fiery Cross. And Morris kind of took a pistol out and put it on his desk, and when he said it, we want to cancel our subscription to the Fiery Cross. And it was just a few nights later when their offices, Fuller and D's marketing, was broken into, and a lot of typewriters smashed, paint slung on the wall, and some vile language, sprayed on the wall. And so they began to get repercussions and learned that, this was not a very popular thing to do, but they knew it was right.
How did you feel about it? I mean, what, as they're going through this change, it must have an impact on you.
Oh yeah, well, I didn't see the beatings that occurred from the Freedom Rides, but of course I heard them talk about it, and I thought myself, this isn't right. And then there was the Selma to Montgomery March. Some pastors that Millard knew up in Ohio, Indiana, I forgot now where they were from, came down to participate. And they didn't have a place to stay. And they got in touch with Millard and said, hey, can we put our bedroll down in your living room floor and have a place to sleep at night? And of course Millard said, sure. And our neighbors found out about it. And we got some pretty nasty phone calls. And but not only did the marchers, there were 4, 5, 6 of them, would stay at our house, but Millard and Morris would take them back to the march route each morning. And they could remember their license plate on their car, a photograph of their license plate. And thus we got some additional nasty calls, from the broader community. So they made a stand, and it wasn't real significant. Never participated in any marches ourselves, but we definitely began to observe, began to see, that times were changing, they needed to change. And we just felt so badly for people who were discriminated against. And we decided, we somehow or another, we needed to get on the other side.
How did that affect your sort of social life, your church life in Montgomery while you're still living there and while you're sort of rethinking it?
Well, our neighbors wouldn't speak to us ever again. We actually Millard and I left Montgomery in 1965. This is a whole other story about our marriage crisis. Millard and Morris both wanted to become millionaires by age 30, and that was requiring them to work night and day, and it basically just destroyed our marriage. I left Millard. And out of that marriage crisis, we felt called to give away all of our wealth and basically start totally over again. And we said, we want God to be in control this time. We've been doing what we want to do. We want God to be in control. So this was mid-60s, and Millard had a lot of energy. He didn't want to just sit around, you know. So the pastor that I counseled with at Broadway United Church of Christ in New York City, Dr. Durgan, was on the board of Tougaloo College, predominantly or totally black college then in Mississippi. And Millard asked him, what do you have any ideas on what we could do now that I've left business, sold my half interest to my partner, Morris Dees, who, by the way, started Southern Poverty Law Center.
Yeah.
And that was 5 or 6 years later. He continued Fuller & Dees marketing for a number of years before he started Southern Poverty Law Center. And so Dr. Durgan said, well, I'm on the board for Tougaloo, and we so badly need a new dorm. He said, how would you like to raise the money for this new dorm on campus? And I said, okay, you know, I know how to make money. I know how to raise money. So we said, okay.
Was that a volunteer job then?
Well, actually it was, because we kept a little bit of money to live on. I think he got a little bit of a salary, you know. We had 3 kids by that time, and we actually planted ourselves in the New York City area.
Okay,
Dr.
I
Durgan
wondered, yeah.
provided an office for Millard to work out of, because I mean, we couldn't come back to Montgomery to raise money. The money was in the north. And so he needed that environment to raise that significant money. And we actually settled our family in New Jersey for 2 years.
That must have been a change for you.
Well, it was, but I'm the type of person that I don't mind a challenge, and it was a whole new, exciting chapter in our lives. We had become so miserable with so much wealth and stuff, and the failing of our marriage, that we wanted to get back to basics. He and I both had a simple middle class upbringing, and it felt good to get kind of back to the basics and be focused on something bigger than ourselves, something with meaning, something that would put our Christian faith into action.
When you're living in New Jersey, what was the racial dynamics like there at that time in the community that you were part of?
Well, as best as I can remember, in Montclair and the Glen Ridge area, it was predominantly white. I think it was because of the economy. It was sort of a wealthy bedroom suburb. We rented a bottom floor of a house, so we didn't live in one of those really nice houses in that area, but Millard commuted into the city by bus every day. Our oldest child, son Chris, went to first grade there, and it seemed like there were 2 or 3 black children in the class. There didn't seem to be any racial discrimination as far as housing was concerned. It was more an affordability issue, I think, for most black families in that area. Of course, Newark was close by, but that was another county. So the population of schools would probably been integrated, but predominantly black there, you see. But by that time, you know, we had become very comfortable around black people, even sought out friendships with with black families. So it was a different environment from being in the South, for sure.
Yeah. I was wondering if with the Freedom Rides, when you were talking about your husband and Morris Dees going and looking at that, and seeing that violence and the impact it had, and their previous affiliation with the Klan, I guess a couple of questions. Do you remember what were they sympathetic to the Klan, or was this a practical kind of political affiliation? I mean, I know you said they weren't exactly members, but going and speaking. Do you remember how they felt about it before they began to question?
Well, it was just like there's the Lions Club or the Kiwanis Club, their activities were different, but they weren't really a part of the meetings, other than back in law school in the late 50s, going to speak.
So it's sort of a political alliance kind of thing? This
Well,
is part of the structure?
yeah, they kind of accepted it.
Yeah.
I guess they thought they were a little radical, but
Yeah. But so it is, right? One of the pieces of background information I got mentioned something about that their law firm defended some of the white men involved in the attacks on the Freedom Riders. Does that do you remember anything about that?
that no, I don't. I
was
don't
wondering
really
if that was the
remember.
person that they were having that interaction with around the Fiery Cross, or if
It could have been,
yeah,
but I'm not sure.
yeah,
I may have it in some notes somewhere.
yeah.
I wish Millard was here
Yeah.
because he could have told you every little detail of
Yeah,
that.
that kind of memory.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely.
What was Huntington like during that period? Was there, I think Bob Zellner, one of the student activists, graduated from Huntington in the late 50s, and he talks about, or maybe it was even earlier, but he talks about taking a sociology class, and they ended up doing some firsthand research that involved going to meet Dr. King, and some of them got kicked out of school, but in some ways
Oh,
it was
yeah.
also a good environment for him, at least. So I wonder what it was like for you to be attending Huntington at that time. What the
I don't
atmosphere was
remember
like.
any kind of activity like that. I was married and living at home.
So it was a very,
So I wasn't real active on campus as if I had
right.
would have been had I lived in the dorm. I was there beginning 1961 through 66, and it could have happened either before or after.
He would have been there before you were there. But I just was curious, whether any of your professors talked about race at all, or if that was just sort of outside of that experience.
No, it was the Christian emphasis was still pretty strong at the college. Some colleges and universities that started off with a more firmer Christian association. It was still. I remember Old and New Testament were required for every freshman entering. Ethics and philosophy were required, and that really broadened my mind a whole lot. The ethics and philosophy, because it examined values in every aspect of life, so that you could kind of objectively look at yourself and your environment and decide, what is valuable. And well, I'm trying to think. I don't remember any black students there. I don't know that they would have been excluded had they applied. It was pretty expensive. I only got to go there because Millard was financing my education. He was able to do that, but here again, as far as the housing is concerned, it was probably just not affordable, or black students may not have felt comfortable. But I know after I left, in the 70s or 80s, there was a real effort to recruit, to bring a more diverse student population to Huntingdon. And of course, I think that exists today.
Yeah.
Could we pause just a minute?
Okay.
Okay, we're back again.
I imagine you must have been pretty busy with the small children and going to school.
Yes, my parents had really implanted in mine and my sister's mind that we should strive to get at least our undergraduate degree. And in fact, I married when I was 18, and I promised my parents that if I married at that young age that I would continue. I would go to school. Well, we had our first baby 11 months after we married. So when he was 10 months old, that's when we had moved to Montgomery, and I enrolled in Huntingdon. At first, I just was part-time, and I started figuring out, gee, it's going to take me 10, 12 years to finish. I said, if I'm away from home and I have help with the children and the housework, I said, I might as well go full-time. So I did, and I finished in 5 years. But yeah, whew. I remember the time when the marchers were staying in our house. I felt kind of bad because we didn't know when they would be getting in at night. I left them on their own to prepare their food, and I've thought, oh my goodness, why wasn't I more hospitable? But, I had exams, I had kids. I don't know, I was young, very young, in my early 20s, and I just thought we were providing a floor for them to sleep on. I didn't know we were feeding the army, and but anyway, it was an interesting experience.
Did you have a sense of the historical significance of the event at the time? The Selma Montgomery March and then the Voting Rights Act?
Not having been actually physically, emotionally involved, I don't know that I understood the significance of it until after we left Montgomery, until later, when I became aware of more and more activities. And Dr. King was jailed right here in Americus, Georgia. And he was like a hot potato, They quickly got him down to 40 miles south of here and put him in Albany jail.
Oh, was that during the Albany Protest? So that's where he was brought during the Albany Movement protest, I think, probably. In December '61, there were a lot of arrests in Albany, and they moved people out to all the different counties.
But this
Could
case,
have been.
he came from here down to Albany, right?
I thought I understood that
what you said?
was
That's
the
what you
case.
said, yeah.
I wasn't here.
Yeah.
This is just what I've heard. I've got people that we could check with to
Well,
make
there were
sure.
also protests. SCLC was back involved in Americus, I think, in '65, maybe. I'm not sure. So.
We didn't visit Quinania Farm that had suffered a lot because of their activity as far as being very sympathetic to blacks in the area of, they hated that there was so much poverty and injustice and the way the blacks were treated, and so they befriended the blacks. They all ate together, the noon meal, and they were all kind of treated on the same social level, and that's what got the local people so agitated. But that was pretty much over by the time we moved here. After Millard raised the money to build that dormitory at Tougaloo College, we felt called to come back south and move to Koinonia to work with Clarence Jordan and the other people that were there. And the violence had subsided. It's a fascinating history that I wish we had time to go into, but as I mentioned, there's an excellent documentary, hour-long documentary that our daughter made, and was aired on public television all over the country, Briars in the Cotton Patch. So that pretty much tells that story. But we had 4 kids. We were starting to build houses. We had partnership farming. We had partnership industries. I was pretty much stretched just to live at Koinonia and be a part of the things that would actually help black people and society there.
But that's part of what happened with civil rights too. Is the material things. It wasn't just legal, but maybe you could give a brief summary of what Koinonia was, and a short one.
Okay, basically, when we moved there, we got to know a lot of families that were living in shacks. Koinonia had befriended these people over the years and helped them out in various ways, but the housing was just so strikingly poor. And a lot of these houses were on the farms of, part of the whole system. My mind's blanking out. The sharecropper system, thank you. So we would visit some of these shacks, and there were big holes in the roofs, holes in the floors. Newspapers had been tacked up on the walls to insulate as best as they could. Windows were broken out, and of course there was no attempt by the farmers to fix the houses. But we had some property at Koinonia, and we said, well, why don't we start what we call a partnership housing movement. We're in partnership with the people that need the help. We're in partnership with God, who has given us the direction to help our brothers and sisters in need. And since blacks could not go to the bank to get loans to buy a house or even buy land, we thought, well, we'll just dedicate some of the land here, the 2,000-something acres at Koinonia, and start building houses, sell them to the families, no profit, no interest. That was the only way the families could afford it. And they were simple houses, like the ones that we started off building were cinder block. But for the first time, families had an indoor bathroom, running water, things we just take for granted. Closets, kitchen cabinets, wow, we saw it make such a difference in the families. For the Johnson family was the first family to move into one of the houses. And then there were families after families that moved in. I remember we kind of hit a point where there were about 10 houses, 10 families moved in, and there were little kids running all over the neighborhood. And we had a playground for them, and a lot of them didn't even know what their names were. Their grandmamas were taking care of them. And so since my degree was in elementary education, we set up a child development center there. So one thing kind of just led to the other. And then we noticed that blacks they were either unemployed or underemployed. So we started partnership industries. Not only did we have the pecan plant and growing peanuts and corn, But we started a sewing industry and a pottery so that we could give employment to people that were making such low income. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. We lived at Koinonia for 5 years to develop these types of things, but the thing that really interested us the most was the housing component. That's what really seemed to make a difference in the lives of poor black people.
Did your idea about that develop through the experience with all these programs? I mean, so you're doing the housing and the child development and the economic development, and so out of all of that, it's out of that experience that you focused in on the housing?
On the housing, and we became interested in seeing if that same philosophy, that same those same principles would work outside the U.S. We moved to Africa. We took our whole family to Africa for 3 years and pioneered the work there. Same thing, no profit, no interest, long-term to pay, 20 years to pay, and it worked there. We came home after building about 120 houses. It took us about a year and a half to get the concrete block factory running and the first house built. But it was a tremendous success. And when we came home, see, we'd been raising support from churches, individuals. Koinonia put some money into it. Companies like Lilly had given us a grant to buy concrete. And so when we came back home, we thought, gee, this idea probably work most anywhere in the world where there's poverty. And we came back with the thought that we would start a worldwide ministry right at Koinonia. But things had changed a little bit, the leadership, and they said, no, we just want to build houses right here in Sumter County. We don't want to do this whole big worldwide thing. So they gave us part of a chicken barn. We had a little desk and a telephone, and we eventually named what we were doing Habitat for Humanity. I moved into town. We needed to make a living. Millard set up a law office and Habitat. He and I, Mom and Pop, we back then. Telephone systems were very unsophisticated. We had one phone on each of our desks for our Habitat and another phone for the law office. And I had to remember, Fuller Law Office or Habitat for Humanity. But that gave us the foundation to involve volunteers and grow Habitat for Humanity over the next 30 years to the point where we were in 100 countries and had built houses for more than 1 million people.
That's remarkable. That's really remarkable. I want to go back. What was the Koinonia community like when you moved into the community? I know you said it had changed and a couple of times, and we were also talking before we went on film, and you were telling me about what it was like when you would come into town, when you were living out there. I'd love to hear more about that experience.
Okay. When we moved to Koinonia in the summer of 1968, there were very few people at Koinonia. In fact, Clarence Jordan and his wife, they had one son still at home. They were exploring other places to go because Koinonia had gotten to a real low ebb. There was only one other family there. There were a few blacks living there. But Clarence was feeling that the work was over there and he would just go teach in a seminary or something like that. But then when we wrote to him, well, actually Millard jotted him a little note when he was flying to a speaking engagement, and he said, Clarence, I'm thinking about leaving Tougaloo. My work is almost done. What have you got up your sleeve? So Clarence wrote back and said, well, I don't have anything up my sleeve, but maybe God has something up his sleeve for both of us. So they got together at a church in Atlanta where Clarence was speaking a revival, or a series of sermons, and Clarence would preach at night, and Millard and Clarence would talk during the day, and they explored all kinds of possibilities. The idea was sort of for us to move down to Koinonia and then maybe move to Atlanta to start some ministries. But the more we thought about it, we brought in a group of friends, a variety of people, pastors, business people, and we brainstormed one big weekend, and they came up with the idea of they named it Koinonia Partnership. And we would experiment with partnership housing, partnership industries, partnership farming, putting the disenfranchised people with more skilled and more able people to build up society and give people a chance that had never had a chance. Yeah, we if you go out there to Koinonia, you would see that it's very simple lifestyle, and most of the places are for families are just very small lapboard houses that were built by volunteers over the years. So we actually moved into the apartment upstairs that Clarence and Florence had lived at. It was one of the first structures that they had built back in the 40s. And I'll never forget when my mother and daddy came for their first visit. They were accustomed to visiting us in this big 13-room house in Montgomery, Alabama with luxury cars and all this kind of stuff. And they climbed up these rickety old stairs and walked into my kitchen. I thought my mother was going to faint. And she said, "Oh, no progress in 3 generations." Oh my goodness. And, I don't think they really ever caught on the significance of, we were having so much richer a life there at Koinonia without all the glitz and glimmer, materialistic kind of things. But I don't think they ever appreciated it.
Let's pause just a second. Okay.
And then, so I don't think they ever really appreciated our new lifestyle, new focus on life. But to us, it was just thrilling. We felt like we were on the cutting edge of something really significant.
Yeah.
And
How would you?
when I mostly did work in the office with the pecan orders and the mailing list, and interface with like I say, it was very a small group of people that were there when we moved there, but very quickly with these new initiatives, volunteers were coming in, a lot of them from the north. It was the hippie movement, long hair, tattered jeans, and it was a time when people were questioning institutions and the way things were done traditionally. And they felt real challenged there and getting new direction on what was really right, and getting their lives sort of at a point that they felt more comfortable, where they could move forward into society. But we would go into town. I remember nobody had a car. We shared cars. We had to reserve a car if we wanted to go into town. But we would shop, in the grocery stores, and people would look at me and they'd say, "You're new here in town, aren't you?" And I'd say, "Yes." "Well, where do you live?" And when I said Koinonia, you know, it was like they couldn't get it away from me fast enough. It was like I was a leper. I was, you know, and I experienced that time after time, but it didn't bother me a whole lot because I knew we were doing the right thing, and I felt sorry for them that they misunderstood and didn't understand, you know, what the true nature of what we were doing. We never were beat up, but before we were there, back in the 50s, there were residents, Coronita, that were beat up. I can remember hearing about a story of Conrad Brown was walking down the street with a guy, and they were sharing a bag of peanut, walking with one of the black residents of Coronita, and they were both arrested. They were arrested. You know, that was just a no-no, to be walking down the street sharing a bag of peanuts. Now, we did have a pretty harrowing experience. There was a young man, a family in Unadilla, Georgia. That's about 30, 40 miles east of here, across, just across the Interstate 75. And this young man wanted to be a doctor, a physician. And he knew that going to the schools were still segregated at that time. He knew that the education he was getting in his school wasn't going to ever get him into med school. So he challenged the system in that rural town. He wanted to get into the high school, the white high school, and boy, it hit the news. We heard about it. It was on TV and the newspapers, and we decided that we needed to go over there and show some support to the family and encourage them, you know, that what they were doing was right. And so Millard and I and Faith, little Faith, she was still in diapers. She's the one that did the documentary on Coronita.
Why don't you lift that up so we can see that?
Okay.
Yes, to say what it is.
Yeah. This is an hour-long documentary entitled Briars in the Cotton Patch that our daughter, Faith Fuller, produced back in the early 2000. It was released in 2003, and she's just done a 10th anniversary update of Briars. And it's been shown on public television in every state in the nation, and it's shown during times like Black History Month, things like that. She realized as an adult that the story of Coronita, here's a picture of Clarence Jordan right here with a bunch of peanuts that he just got out of the field. She realized that the story had never really been told to the... There'd been books written, articles in newspapers and magazines, but there never had been a significant documentary of that story. And she took it on herself to produce this documentary. She'd never done a documentary before. It took her about 3 years. And she did the research, she raised the money. As I recall, she needed about $50,000 to do all that it needed. You know, there's a, as you probably understand, a lot of people understand, it takes a lot of things other than just filming and editing film and actually producing a film. There's a lot that has to take place along with that. So we're very proud that she did that.
Well, what was the story of Clarinet before you went there?
It was founded by Clarence and Florence Jordan and Martin and Mabel England, who only stayed about 2 or 3 years, I guess. But they were there in the very beginning. They basically started out with a poor plot of land, you know, red Georgia clay. And Clarence, being a graduate of the University of Georgia in agriculture, he loved farming. And so he thought that, that would be a good venue to start an intentional Christian community to live out the teachings of Jesus that he had studied about in seminary, Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. He felt very strongly about this because having grown up in a small South Georgia town, Talbotton, Georgia, he saw the discrimination. He had friends, little black friends, that he could play with, but they couldn't go in his house, for instance. They couldn't go in his school. He saw the restrictions there on his little friends at a very early age, and he began to question, whether that was right or wrong. And then, of course, when he became a Greek New Testament scholar and read the original Greek, he could see that what he was reading there didn't match up with the culture that he was raised in. And he wanted to experiment with these, what were pretty different principles, as you know, because that's why the civil rights movement was generated, because of all the injustices. And it was, the first few years was pretty much establishing the farm, getting housing. I know that Florence and Clarence had just a baby, and she lived with his parents in Talbotton first couple of years because there was no running water. I mean, it would have been very difficult for them to have her and the children there. But they established the traditions of a Christian community, sharing the noon meals. Well, actually, I think they shared lunch and dinner at that time, a meal in common in the dining room. They held worship services, and all of it was done in very simple structures. There was no actual church building. In fact, Clarence said that a guy came along in his Cadillac one day. Clarence was, he was a very good mechanic too. He was, happened to be under a tractor repairing a motor, and it was all greasy, eyeballs and things like that. And so he got up, in front of the tractor and kind of wiped off his hands and extended for a handshake and said, then the guy said, "I'm out here. I want to see if you are really a Christian community like you say you are, and I don't see a church anywhere. You couldn't be a Christian community."
Well, where did the other families and other people who ended up living at Koinonia come from? Were they local to the area, or did most people come from outside?
Most people came from outside. I think it was kind of rare for us to be Southerners and move there.
Is that true of the black families as well as the white?
All the black families were local. They were from that county, pretty much. One of the reasons why it had gotten down to such small numbers when we moved there in 1968 is because the black families were threatened. Now, some kind of organized and moved up north. New York, I think. They established another Koinonia community up north, but I think it kind of fizzled out after a while. But the black families that stayed, they were threatened to the point where they said, if you continue to go to Koinonia, we're going to burn your house down, or we're going to kill members of your family. I mean, really serious threats. And the lady who worked in the candy kitchen at Koinonia, Miss Gussie Jackson, This happened way before we moved there. But they threatened to burn her house down, and they did. They set it on fire. And she was at home at the time. And she went running out and fell on her knees and prayed to God to put out that fire. And it went out.
Really?
But I don't know that they were ever successful in burning down any of the houses, but it scared people so badly that they kind of just drifted away.
And this is in the 50s and 60s probably? Or?
Yeah, I would say late 50s.
Yeah. With, so are most of the black families that were involved with Koinonia, they didn't live on the property?
Some did, some didn't.
Okay.
Some still worked for farmers doing the seasonal crops. And then in the wintertime, when we needed help in the pecan and fruitcake candy kitchen, they would come and have temporary employment there. But, you know, by the time we got there, there were still people that were afraid to associate too closely with Koinonia. As long as they just were going there for a job, it was kind of different, yeah. And a few would come and join us for a community lunch sometimes, but they were still nervous about those threats that were made years earlier.
You said you were telling a story about you said a harrowing experience where the black student in Unanita?
Oh, I never did finish that story, did I? In Unadilla. Unadilla, Georgia. Okay. So it was about this time of year, a little earlier. I remember this. There was a older guy that had a big strawberry patch, and we just picked bowls full of strawberries that morning. So we thought it'd be a nice thing to do to take the family some strawberries. So it was Millard, me, and Faith. Yeah, I know how we got sidetracked on Briars and the Cotton Patch.
Yes.
So we get over there and we find the house, and no one was there. It was probably like about 2 o'clock. So we figured, well, she's off at work. Forgotten the name of the family right now, but and we figured, well, the kids are still at school. So we sat on the front porch, and pretty soon a few of the children came home from school, and they didn't know us from Adam's house cat, and so we talked to them and told them while we were there and kind of let them know that we were friendly. Well, the mother hadn't gotten home yet, but all of a sudden, this police car comes roaring up, and the policeman got out of the car, and he had his gun, and he said, "What are you doing here at this nigger's house?" And we said, "Well, we just came to visit." And he said, "Well, don't you know it's against the city ordinance for whites to visit with niggers?" And we said, Millard said, he kind of a little smart aleck, but he said, well, no, but if you have such an ordinance, you know, it's not worth the paper it's written on. Boy, did that make him mad. And he said, "Okay, you're under arrest." And I was still up on the porch holding Faith in my arms, and Millard was down, you know, close to the policeman. And so I said to myself, I'm not going to let him take Millard off in this police car. And so I walked down and I said, if my husband was doing something wrong, I was too. You got to arrest me too.
And the baby.
Yeah. Okay, so he took us down to City Hall, to the jail, and he said, "Okay, you sit over there. I'm going to call the city commissioner, the county commissioner. We're going to have a meeting about this." So we sit there, and I begin to think, oh my gosh, if they lock us up, what am I going to use for diapers? I mean, I didn't bring any extra diapers. I thought, well, how am I going to manage this? So we sat there, and Faith was toddling around. There was a piano in there. And she walks over, and, you know, she starts playing the notes, and I go get her. I said, shh, Faith, we don't want to disturb them. Millard said, oh, let her go ahead and make all the noise she wants to. He was more ticked off than I was. Well, it wasn't long before they came out, and they said, okay, said, since this is only the first time you've done this, that we have record of this, we're going to let you go for now. But, Millard heard this, but I didn't really understand what they were saying. He said, but we're not responsible for you when you leave town. Millard read that, you know, they were going to come after us or try to do us harm. So they said, okay, you can go. We said, well, you brought us here. You got to take us back to our car. So Millard said, okay. He said, we're going to get out of here and we're going to go to the first motel that we can find and check in. And by the time we got there and registered and we're walking in our room, we saw a van pull in. It was full of men, we think. So we got in the motel room. I didn't know what to expect by then. So I took Faith back into the bathroom. It was like your general motel rooms where the bathroom's always in the back. And I thought, if they're going to start shooting us, maybe that would be the safest place. Millard got on the phone. He called, he looked in the yellow pages at the churches. And so the first church he called was the Episcopal Church. He thought that maybe they would be the most sympathetic. And the rector answered, and Millard explained the situation, that we may be in a threatening position, and would he come over and help us? And he said, I've promised the ladies that I would come and speak to their little tea this afternoon. I'm sorry, I cannot come. Well, then I think he called a couple more churches. There was no answer. So he thought, well, I'm going to take my chances and call the sheriff of this county and see if he'll come. So apparently he and the police chief weren't such good friends. So he did come over. And in fact, he got in touch with the FBI. Maybe they had had some incidences like this before. But he finally kind of calmed things down. We had called Clarence to come get us, to follow us home. And but it was kind of scary.
Did Koinonia?
Hold on a second. Okay.
Did you mentioned that back in Montgomery when Morris Dees and your husband were telling the Klansmen that they weren't going to subscribe anymore, that they pulled the pistol out? At Koinonia, did any of the residents ever use self-defense?
No, there were no guns. I think they had one. I think Clarence had one gun in his house, but he would use it to like kill wild dogs or something like that. But they were totally against returning violence for violence. In fact, at one point, when cars were riding by and shooting into the farm, sometimes bullets would narrowly escape kids that were playing outside. There are still today some bullet holes. That, in fact, the place where we were living, there was a bullet hole that came in and just barely missed one of the Jordan daughters. It shattered a mirror, but it missed her by inches. Nobody was ever killed. But they thought, well, these are basically coward kind of folks, and they would take turns sitting out at the road at night. to demonstrate that they weren't afraid, and if they want to shoot, just go right ahead, you know. And there's a lot covered in the documentary, the Briars documentary, about those kind of incidences and how the children felt about it. They were interviewed, and a lot more detail on that.
I'm looking forward to seeing it. So where did your children go to school when you moved here? That must have been an interesting situation.
Well, we were out in the county, and at that time, and for the longest time until just recent years, there were two schools. There was county schools and city schools. So we were living in the county. Interestingly enough, when we got, well, let me say this, when we first moved here, we only had two school-age kids, and they went to a little school, a little country school. And then we went away to Africa. The oldest two were in an American school in Kinshasa, and that was wonderful. That was a much better education than they were receiving here. But when we came back, we had three in public school, and our youngest child, who was born at Koinonia, went to the Child Development Center that we had started before we left. And interestingly enough, the daughter, Faith, that made the documentary, she was in class with Amy Carter. It was right at the end of the Carter campaign that we came back from Africa. And Faith and Amy were in 4th grade together. The school was over in Plains, of course, where the Carters still live. But there was Secret Service in the class, and they allowed Amy to go climb a tree and read rather than play on the playground. That was kind of interesting, but the older two, Chris and Kim, went to high school at Plains, and they would come home from school, especially the daughter that was in like 9th grade by this time, crying because the schools were just awful. These were white schools, but the building had become in such disarray. It eventually became the Carter Museum in Plains, and a lot of restoration of that school took place. It's beautifully done now. But it was in horrible condition then. I know that she complained about bird droppings coming from the ceiling, and the teachers would just pretty much let them look at magazines, not much instruction going on. The quality of the schools greatly improved. That's one of the things that encouraged us to move into town. The fact that Koinonia really didn't want to be part of the worldwide movement, and then we needed better schools for our kids. We had better schools here in the city. They got a really good education here. When the schools were integrated, I'd say in the late 70s, the quality of education continued to be really good, and to the point where all of our kids went to college, finished college. There are complaints that the education kids are getting here is not adequate, but any kid that wants to go to college, we have an excellent college here in Americus. We have a big technical college. Even since we're a small town here, we have good quality education.
So the schools didn't integrate here until the late 70s?
I believe that's right. I don't think they were integrated when we first came back from Africa. I think it was pretty soon after that.
Sort of nationally, one of the big moments was around 1970. There was a big Supreme Court decision that said you can't operate separate schools in the same district. And I wondered if that had an impact around here.
Well, it took a while.
Moved a little slow.
It moved pretty slowly.
Yeah.
I could be wrong.
I was just curious.
I don't think they were integrated in 1976 when we came back from Africa, but I think it was a short time after that they were.
Yeah. Did you know much about the civil rights movement in Americus after you moved here, or did you hear much about it?
Other than what the stories at Koinonia,
Yeah.
that was pretty much, I don't know if I should term it a hot spot, or that was where a lot of transformation occurred at Koinonia. I heard more about what happened in the general area after we'd been here a while. We have a wonderful historian. His name is Alan Anderson, who has studied the history of Sumter County from the very beginning, and he wrote a book. He's got a lot of details about those kind of things.
Because, one of the things that Americus is kind of infamous for, I guess, is these little girls that were arrested and put in jail. This would have been before you were here, but I wondered if something like that is part of the consciousness
I
of the
met
community.
one of them.
Did you?
Yeah. I can't remember her name, but I met one of them that was arrested.
Is that something that people in the area? I'm also interested in historic memory, so I'm sort of wondering like how, like in the community that I grew up in, I'm sort of interested in how people understand the past, and so I wonder if it's something that people around here think about or talk about much.
I remember now where I met her. Koinonia had a celebration of the 75th anniversary of Koinonia was last year.
Okay.
And people came from all over who had lived at Koinonia at one time or the other. And I met a lot of these folks that I'd heard stories about. And yeah, it was really interesting. I can tell you about an incident that happened in 1965
All right.
that I'd forgotten about. That was when we came to visit some friends of ours. He had been kicked out of his church in Birmingham, Alabama for proposing, that they should be more welcoming to black people. And so he came over to Koinonia to live. I mean, they were just really out, didn't know what to do. And so he had actually preached in our little church that we started in our home in Montgomery, Alabama. But we came to visit them. This was right after we decided to leave business and give away our money, and we were looking for new direction. So we decided to look the Henrys up, Carol and Al Henry, and that's when we first met Clarence. And we were so amazed at Koinonia and its history, and the simple lifestyle was appealing to us then because we were getting rid of all of our material possessions and wealth. We stayed a month. Instead of 2 hours, we stayed a month.
Oops.
Yeah, and so that was December,
Yeah.
almost all of December of 1965. Well, Carol Henry's father was head of the Georgia Baptist convention, or I think it was. That's what it was. And he had been invited to speak at a Christmas church service at night at First Baptist Church in Americus, which was totally segregated, just total white congregation. And so he came out to visit his daughter, had lunch with us, and he said, I'm preaching tonight. I want to invite all of you to come. Well, here we were, an integrated group, and so we had a little discussion about that in the afternoon, and Clarence said, well, we've been invited. We ought to go. Whoever wants to go. So we loaded up in several cars. There were probably about 20 of us. Clarence, Millard, and me, Collins McGee, he was the only black person that would go with us. All the rest were Al and Carol Henry and some of the other residents of Koinonia. So we started filing in. A big crowd was coming into First Baptist Church on Lee Street in Americus, and so we were kind of single file, and the deacons were passing out programs for the service. And when a black hand reached out to take one of the programs, you know, it was like, what? But I mean, things continued. We all got in, and we occupied one full pew. And so we were settling in, and there were several little ladies on the pew in front of us, and they looked back and they started whispering, you know, and they got up and they moved somewhere else. Same thing happened to the people that were seated behind us. They got up and moved somewhere else. So here we were like an island on this one pew in the church. And they started singing Christmas hymns. Oh gosh, what was that hymn we were singing? I'll think of it in a minute. Anyway, along comes the head deacon, who happened to be the fire chief in town. And he comes in, and he grabs a hold of Collins McGee, and he said, "You got to get out of here." And Clarence said, wait a minute, we were invited to come here. He said, you know, we're here to worship with you, to enjoy this service with you. And he said, that's beside the point. You can stay, but he's got to get out of here. You know, jerking on Collins' arm. And Clarence said, oh, never mind. He said, if you don't want Collins here, we're going to all leave. So we all got up and we left. So there were a few deacons that came and talked to Clarence and Millard and a few others and said, "What are you doing bringing this nigger into our church? Don't you know that we don't allow that?" And so Clarence said, "Well, sir, I thought this was God's church. And God is no respecter of persons." He said, "We didn't come here to do harm." He said, "That's beside the point. The federal government doesn't own this church. We own this church." And so, you know, we left. And it was interesting. As we walked out to the sidewalk, Clarence, I never will forget, I can remember seeing him do this today. He turned around and he looked at the church, big white columns, and there were floodlights, you know, just beaming on this church building. And Clarence made the remark, "Just look there." He said, "All that light on the outside, and it's dark on the inside." There were times when we lived at Koinonia that groups came in. I have pictures of those incidences where we had black visitors that wanted to attend church in town. So Clarence and Millard and a few others would go with them, but they were armed. The deacons were armed during that time. Now, since then, there's been a huge change. Yeah. Blacks are welcome in almost any church here in town. Been a huge change.
Do you know how that came about?
Well, I guess the culture began to change as the old generation began to die off, and some of the laws changed. I mean, some of the poor, of course, couldn't really force churches to make that change. Clarence often says, you know, everything's integrated except the jails and the churches, and I have hope for the jails.
Well,
But you know, it was just happened over time. I'd like to think that Habitat's ministry developing here in Americus had something to do with it, because we had people coming in from all over the United States, some people from different countries in the world, and I think it helped to broaden people's ideas of who God's children were.
I wondered how the local community felt and feels about Habitat and the work that you've done.
Well, at first, you know, it was uncomfortable. I remember when we bought a house in town on Church Street. We moved into town from Koinonia, and our kids started going out and playing with children in the neighborhood. And when they learned that we had moved into town from Koinonia, they didn't allow their kids to play with our kids anymore for a while. And we had broken glass on our driveway most every morning when we would wake up, and I just go out and sweep it in my dustpan. But there were two tragedies that happened within a week after we moved in. One was a huge house that had been on the market that had just sold, like a big 3-story mansion of a house, caught fire about a block down from where we lived. Millard was away on a speaking engagement, and I woke up during the night and I heard all these car doors slamming. Oh my goodness. You know, now not only do we have broken glass on our driveway, but, you know, some action's being taken here. So I didn't turn on any lights. I tiptoed to the front window and looked out and was relieved to see that these pickup trucks, people that were getting out of the pickup trucks, were hurrying down the street. And then I looked and saw the big fire. So I breathed a sigh of relief there. But then word began to spread, you know, that we were starting work kind of like what we had at Koinonia, and that was in Americus, Georgia, and some hippie kind of people were coming, you know, as volunteers, and there was very little understanding of what we were trying to do to eradicate poverty housing. And there was some really bad areas. A lot of the streets had not been paved, just terrible shacks. And so, you know, we got organized. We not only started work here in Americus, but we were starting down in South Florida in Immokalee, where a lot of migrant workers were. We were starting work in Appalachia. Those were on Johns Island, South Carolina, where there was a lot of poverty. People were getting in touch with us because they had heard through Koinonia newsletters and the newsletters that we were producing, you know, that we were spreading this idea and that we were willing to kind of help them get started. But I think there were two things that really changed and opened people's hearts here in Americus, Georgia. One was there were a lot of seniors, all ages, that were coming here to help us, that were volunteers at Habitat. And they would go to the local churches, and they would begin to explain, you know, what we were all about. Then when we started having blitz bills, like building 10, 20 houses in a week's time, and we had hundreds of people coming in to work on those projects. And we started involving the local churches, getting them to sponsor a half of a house. A few of them came out and volunteered. The idea began to catch on, and people began to see really what we were all about. They were trying to put God's love in action to really help people.
How were you able to get the first churches locally to get on board?
Well, some really nice people mostly from up north, would start attending the churches, and they would make friends, and then they would invite their friends to come and participate that week. And, a week, that wasn't very threatening, so they would do it. But I think the thing that really changed the climate and the business community, they saw where volunteers came and bought a lot of groceries and a lot of this and a lot of that, So it was a boost for the economy. Plus, we were employing people too, permanent people. They were buying houses, and the business people began to be more supportive. We were bringing in, our first year of Habitat, we raised about $70,000. Nobody knew about it, it was a real struggle in the early years. Before the Carters got involved, really, in 1984, it was a real struggle to raise money. And then, right before we left Habitat in 2005, commonly $250,000 or more dollars would come in every day.
Every day.
Every day. We had work in 100 countries. We had over 900 employees that we were supporting too. Had headquarters offices. Yeah. And then after we left, the board made the decision to move Habitat headquarters to Atlanta.
So that must have had an impact on the Americus economy.
Yes, it did.
Yeah.
It did, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
When you would have one,
Excuse me.
Yeah.
when you would do the blitz builds, and so you'd have people come in for a week or something, where would they be staying?
Oh, well, some of them stayed in private homes, and that kind of helped
I
spread the
wondered
word,
about-
too.
Yeah.
Sometimes they bunked down in churches, or sometimes the college they were on break and made dormitory rooms available. So that helped to educate the community too, getting them involved, and they could see what a difference it was making in the lives of families. The kids started doing better in school. I remember I had a teacher told me, we were in the grocery store, and she said, "Wow," she said, "it's amazing the difference in the student in my class since they moved into a Habitat house." He said he's better behaved, making better grades, and so it was those kind of experiences that helped people to see that we were really on to something here.
Yeah. Nothing like having a decent standard of
Decent
living, right?
standard of living, yes.
When you were talking about those discussions, I think in 1968, about sort of what direction, and when you moved to Koinonia and developed the housing and the economic development, and it seems like roughly at the same time in that same era, there's a whole co-op movement going on, and there's all sorts of programs that are partly coming out of the civil rights movement, partly related to the war on poverty. Are you part of these larger conversations? Is that influencing the thinking that you all were involved in at the time, and the work you were doing?
Well, certainly, we tried to keep our focus on housing. There were temptations to broaden our ministry into other areas, but we were certainly working side by side with other organizations, other efforts to build awareness of needs of humanity, not only here in the United States, but around the world.
Where did your international interest come from? Do you know?
Well, our goal right from the beginning was to eliminate poverty housing in the world.
Yeah.
Right after we had left Montgomery, left business, we decided that we wanted to visit missionaries in Africa, and we had the United Church of Christ, which was Millard's church that he was raised in to arrange a tour. Actually, they had asked him to do this, to visit missionaries and come back and tell about what he saw and to raise money and awareness of mission work. But he turned them down because he figured it'd cost him too much. It'd slow him down on his first million too much. So we decided that that was one of the first things we wanted to do, and it was a 6-week trip. Got grandparents to take care of our kids, and we went to 5 countries in Africa. And as it turned out, we went back to one of the places we visited.
Which countries did you go on that first trip?
We went to Tanzania, what was then Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, South Africa, Ghana, and what was then called the Congo. When we lived there in the 70s, it was Zaire, and now it's Congo again, Democratic Republic of Congo.
Right. Yeah. So how did you decide to go back to Congo, Zaire?
Well, you know, when we visited there, the church wanted to reinstitute a business that a Belgian businessman had started, and somehow or another the church had acquired it, but the dump truck was worn out, and several other aspects of the concrete block business had just broken down. So Millard promised that he would come back home and raise money to buy them a new dump truck. So we had that connection there. And so when we started thinking about where we could build houses, we thought of that place. You know, what a perfect place. The church invited us to come and help with the economy of the people, and we thought, well, we'll just make concrete blocks and build houses. So it was just kind of a natural, well, we feel like it was a God-planned thing, you know, that evolved.
How did it influence you to live outside the country for that long, you know, and take your children?
Well, I don't know. I've always been adventuresome.
Yeah.
I told you that my parents were in the appliance business, and we went to Florida 1 week out of the year, and that's it. I didn't go anywhere else. So I was interested in seeing other parts of the world. That trip that we made when I was 25 years old to Africa, it broadened my horizons a lot, and it just and Millard was adventuresome too. You know, we had learned how to live simply. Learn how to make yogurt, make bread, all these kind of things at Quinonias. So it was kind of a good training ground to being a missionary. Plus my own simple upbringing. My mother taught me to sew and to cook, and you know, we were good at surviving in most anywhere. So we had this vision, and anytime we'd go to a new country or a new place, we'd read books, and you know, we tried to understand the culture, and we built what we called appropriate technology. We used appropriate technologies so to keep the cost of the houses down, whatever the style house, whatever materials were available in that area, and you know, doing a lot of manual labor so that we wouldn't have machines breaking down. And we enjoyed visiting families that, in fact, many times we would stay with families that had moved into a habitat house. Sri Lanka, South Korea, Fiji. The families thought it was kind of interesting, you know, that the founders and the president and his wife of Habitat for Humanity would want to stay in their little humble abode. But we took great joy in that because that gave us inspiration to want to provide that for more and more families.
I was just thinking those countries you listed, some of those had just been through anti-colonial movements, or had just sort of, and some were still colonial countries.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have a sense of that at the time, or notice any differences?
That's an interesting question. Of course, that was certainly the case in Zaire. Now, Congo, the Belgians, they had won their independence actually right about the same time we visited, and for the first time in 1965. So it was still, because of the independence, you know, most of the Belgian business people had left the Catholic Church, and foreign missionaries were there. But it was a time when a huge population had come into the cities to find work. They were now free. They didn't have to stay out of the cities. They no longer had to have a card to move around. So they were just flooding into the cities, which made the housing situation just overwhelming. We built 120 houses, but that was just a drop in the bucket.
Yeah.
So after we left, though, more and more, it continued, and it spread into other parts of Zaire and other African countries. Now, I guess that would also apply to South Africa. They were still, apartheid was strong back in 1965, and also when we started work there. But we started work in the townships, first of all, and there were other programs where there was job training and opportunities for people to start little micro industries, and that way they could afford to make the payments for our habitat houses. So it was a way to liberate, get people out from underneath the oppression, just like we did at Cornelia.
Yeah.
Oh, we had farmers to come, and I know we were just almost finished with a house. Family about ready to move in, and here comes a farmer on his horse. It had rained, and he just went round and round and round on his horse and just made a mess of the front yard. He was mad. And there was another instance where Ethel Dunning had worked in the kitchen, done housework for a farmer and his wife. And they found out that they were going to move, going to have a house of their own and move off of their farm. And they cut off their water. They had to haul water in barrels for several months while their house was under construction. And to beat all, that woman had enough nerve to come and ask Ethel to bake cakes for them at Christmas.
She miscalculated, maybe?
And they never turned her water back on. She asked them to, but they never did. Excuse me, but she told us, she said, you know, I baked those cakes. She said, I had to show them that I was bigger than how I was being treated.
But they never came around.
Not that I know of.
Yeah. You mentioned a few minutes ago a church in your home in Montgomery that you started. Can you tell us about that?
Well, we moved to Montgomery. We just wanted to go to a church. Millard grew up in the Congregational Church. It eventually became United Church of Christ when the Congregational merged with Evangelical and Reformed churches. And he said, well, there isn't a Congregational church here in Montgomery. Let's start one.
Okay.
So we started in our home.
Yeah.
And, we built it up to about 20 people. And then we found, we actually started meeting in the chapel of Huntingdon College. They let us use that on Sunday mornings for a while. And then we built a little building on the outskirts of Montgomery for a church out there.
And were you just lay ministers then? I mean, did you have a minister?
No, we were like, we eventually hired one, but Al Henry was one of our visiting ministers until we hired a full-time minister. Looks like one of those Georgia gnats is about to get us.
No. They've discovered us.
Anyway, there's a book that Millard wrote. Actually, he was pretty good at writing diaries when he was in business. He kind of kept a record of what was happening every day. And he would record other things that he was involved in, like developing the church. He helped to get property and things like that. And I guess we were the largest donors in the congregation until we left. 10%, no, not even 1%. But we say that after we left, the church died. So our church membership died and went to heaven. And we didn't join another church until we joined Maranatha Baptist Church in Plains. Jimmy Carter twisted our arm. He said, "Okay, I've joined Habitat. Now I want you to join our church." So we did. Well, let's see now. Where were we? I think I got a little off track.
Oh, I just asked you about that church. I was actually in your biography and some of these high points that you put together, which is very helpful. You mentioned some of the law cases that your husband Millard was involved with. You said sort of representing some African Americans who were seeking employment in law enforcement, and then you mentioned here something about the black boycott in Americus in 1971 and marches. Can you tell us about some of that?
Yeah, when we were living at Koinonia, we became aware of some pretty serious police brutality against black people. And at that time, the police force and the sheriff, county law enforcement also was totally segregated, all white. And, the schools were, soon to integrate. And, but anyway, it was a real kind of volatile time when changes were taking place. But the law enforcement was totally white. And there were some black people that wanted to get employed. They wanted, and things just kind of came to a head when there was so much brutality against black people. Very unfair administration of enforcing laws. And so black people just rebelled. They kind of stood up and said, "This has got to stop." And when it didn't, then they said, "Okay, well, we're not going to do any business in town. If we have to, we'll go to neighboring communities to buy our groceries." And so that got the attention. That got the attention. There was a march downtown, Americus, and we actually, I participated in that as well as Millard. We walked down the streets. There was not a car. Everybody stayed in the stores. People were peering out the windows. I mean, everybody was afraid, the riots were going to break out. But we wanted it to be a peaceful march. We just wanted to show some determination and and demonstrate how serious, that the situation was. So I can remember so well there was a meeting called in one of the churches, black churches, and Millard was asked to speak. And everybody was just so riled up. And Millard started speaking in his usual, enthusiastic kind of tone, and he realized that he had to calm himself down because the crowd was about to lose it. And he was able to calm things down and to have a focus on what would actually bring about change. And he said, some of you black folks ought to step up and apply for some of these jobs. So when they did, of course, they were turned down, but then they were able to file a law case, and so they eventually, some of them got hired. And then there was a woman that wanted to get on the force. Here again, Oh, and they used the excuse, she's too pretty. This might distract the men from doing their job. And Millard said, that won't wash. That will not wash. And so she got her hired. But then also he became aware of the tremendous injustices as far as court cases, murder cases, or black accused of murder, and he began to get involved in taking some of those, what we call death penalty or death row cases. Even if it was obvious that someone was guilty, it was really bad if they had killed a white person. Mm-hmm. That was almost certain death penalty. And all the juries were pretty much white. And Millard figured out why, or else in his partnering with people like Millard Farmer in Atlanta, who was also doing a lot of death penalty cases. They discovered that black folks did not believe in the death penalty because they were serious. They knew that it worked against black people. So when there was a selection of the jury, all an attorney had to do was to ask, do you believe in the death penalty? And they would say no. And they would never get selected. So therefore you had an all-white jury, and it was easy to persuade them to come back with a verdict of guilty, and they wanted to call for the death penalty. So Millard was very persuasive. He was just great in the courtroom, and he took great pride in getting a jury to pray with him one time. He wanted them, to focus in on, is this really what God would want you? He had, this was before the days when the courthouses were air conditioned, and about after lunch, things would get. It was hard for the jury, persons on the jury to stay awake. And he would wait for one of them to nod off, like this. And he said, he'd start saying, this is a serious matter, somebody's life, And if you're a Christian, you need to really consider whether you should sentence this person to death. And he said, it's so serious, we need to pray about this. He said, let's bow our heads, and he'd go look over the one that was sound asleep and say, thank you, and then people would think that he was already praying, and so they'd bow their heads. I'm telling you, whatever it took, he was able to bring justice. A lot of the times it would involve, life sentence, but at least kept people off of death row.
Did you ever work with Donald Hollowell on any of those cases? Do you know Donald Hollowell? He was a black lawyer in Atlanta. He ended up working for the EEOC, I think, at a certain point. But I think he was involved. It might have been a different era slightly, but I think he was involved in trying to fight some of the inequities in the death penalty cases in Georgia, too.
That name does not sound familiar. Millard practiced law until Habitat got so big that he just didn't have the time for it anymore. I thought it was a shame because he was so good. At one point, he partnered with a lawyer in Columbus who did the most of the preparation and the depositions on a case, and then a couple of days before, he would inform Millard of the facts and everything, and then Millard actually was the lead lawyer in the case. So, but he had to give it up because Habitat was just growing at such a phenomenal rate.
That is pretty extraordinary.
Yeah.
It was interesting for me to read more of the history because I guess I grew up with the idea of Habitat as this well-established, organization, and to sort of learn more about how it was founded.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting, to think of it as always this well-established and so successful. There was something I was thinking about, and now it's like, what was it like to participate in that march? Were you the only whites or among the only whites in that march you were mentioning in Americus?
We weren't the only whites. I think there were some other people from Koinonia that participated.
But primarily Koinonia, not...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
What was it? So, did you have any fear or any concerns about being part of the march?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
But, I knew what I was doing was right, and by that time we had lived at Koinonia for a good long while. Having moved there in '68 and the march was '71, it was just that we were taught you do what you feel in your heart is right, and if you get harmed or get put in jail or even lose your life, you've done the right thing.
Yeah.
Take a stand for something.
How do you think the civil rights movement and it's obvious it's obvious that your Christian faith is clearly so significant. Does that intersect with the civil rights movement in the ways that you and Millard chose to focus your lives?
Oh, absolutely. It was part of what was the most prevalent at that time in history. It was the most obvious thing that needed to be changed.
Were there things that you missed about your old life?
No. Not really.
Yeah. Did you lose friends or any, sort of part of the sort of white society?
I'd say I gained a whole lot more friends than I lost. Oh yeah, that's an understatement there. It was our families that were disgusted, really disappointed. We were shunned by most of our family members on my side of the family and Millard's side of the family. They just didn't get it. They didn't understand why we were running counter to the culture. In fact, there were a few, when we left business, gave our money away, they said, you need to be in a mental institution. Giving up all that money. But it was like what was holding us back from a real life, and it had destroyed our marriage. We just wanted to be done with it, start totally over. But
Was it hard to deal with your family's feelings?
yeah, it was. My mother didn't want to discuss anything that was controversial. And we tried to have discussions with my dad, and we just finally gave up. We just kept it on a family and grandkids and,
What about your sister?
family. My sister was very supportive. When she and her husband married, a couple of years before we did, Millard and I, they had moved to California. And that was sort of one of the hearts of liberal thinking out there. So yeah, I should have made a mention of that my sister certainly was an exception.
Yeah. It seems interesting that then Morris Dees also sort of seems to follow a similar path, I guess. I mean, without knowing a lot, but founded the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Exactly. Yeah. He started off, I think one of his first things was to integrate the Alabama State Patrol, something like that.
It's a challenge, yeah.
That was a big deal. And
Huge
then
deal.
he got more into representing people who had been harmed by the Klan or other subversive groups. His support has greatly expanded and diversified, to other minority groups.
Does that go back to that same incident with the Freedom Rides?
I never asked him that question,
Yeah.
but I would certainly think so.
Did he stay in touch with you all, and sort of, do you think he was influenced by the decisions that you all made?
I don't know. We didn't have much contact.
Yeah.
We were really busy into Quantity and Africa and work with Habitat, and he was kind of doing his thing, every once in a while our paths would cross, but there wasn't a whole lot of contact there.
Yeah. It's sort of interesting, the trajectory, there. So I haven't asked you a lot of questions about Habitat because I think it's more documented, but are there things that we haven't talked about that you think are particularly significant or that you'd like to focus on with Habitat or anything else?
Well, I don't think so. If I had some time to reflect more on that at a later time, I might, but nothing comes to mind right now.
Yeah, well, one of the things that's intrigued me listening to you is, this converging of God's plan and practical things like houses and education, and the civil rights movement, which was this moral and legal issue. Do you feel that it all fit together in some way, or how does it all fit together?
Well, it is. It is. It kind of all fits together. Everybody had their own piece of the puzzle, putting it in at different times. It finally began to make sense and began to really make changes within the society, but it was very, very slow. like, you know, any kind of major change in society. Takes a long, long time. But the thing that has been very interesting is the civil rights movement has spurred so many other freedom movements outside the country, with women, you know, with other minorities, even with the mentally ill. You know, the civil rights movement proved that people could speak out and demonstrate another way and eventually get to people's hearts and minds and make real change happen. But sometimes, you know, it takes years to put all those pieces together. And I think that, and to put it in religious terms, we're all called to different pieces of that puzzle. And it was always interesting to me to see how people kind of group together. We'll work on this, you know, we'll work on that, and we'll do this, we'll do that, you know. And just how it all evolved. And that those patterns that were set on how the civil rights movement unfolded is a great pattern, a great demonstration, a great template on what kind of work it takes to make other changes. Whether it's getting people to wear their seat belts or, you know, provide health care. You know, there's a lot of changes that are going on right now in our society. It just takes time. It takes people courageously speaking out, making sacrifices.
So are those some of the things that you think were most significant about the civil rights movement, that being willing to take a stand and speak out?
Oh, absolutely. People putting their lives on the line.
Yeah.
I heard Andrew Young speak once, telling some of the stories. I can remember one in particular about the march on Birmingham, where they used the fire trucks, the fire hoses, and everybody just deciding to sit down. You know, they hadn't planned to do that. It just, someone started sitting down as a gesture of being humble, and they eventually turned those hoses off. But it's just some powerful stories. I can't wait to see some of the other interviews. I know I've watched a couple that already been posted on the website.
Yeah, well, I think it's going to be a remarkable addition to our history, so I'm really glad that we were able to talk with you.
Mm-hmm. Well, at the beginning, I was more of an observer, kind of taking it all in, being educated by my husband's experiences of opening up to a wider variety of people, and then my contacts with people all over the United States and all over the world, and seeing that everybody, you know, has certain things in common, no matter where they are or what color skin or whatever culture they come in. I would relate to people even if I couldn't speak the language. You know, I would make gestures towards their children, you know, and I could tell them a little bit about my children, you know, and people have grandchildren. I've heard similar things from the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter, how they would relate to big, important statesmen and stateswomen around the world. Just get down on a real common human level. And people really appreciate it. I mean, Millard was so good at this. When we would visit, he would make a fool out of himself dancing in Africa. Oh, it would just make the crowds go berserk, you know, because they'd never seen a white man making a fool of themselves before. They were accustomed, you know, these stiff shirt, tie suit dignitaries, you know, that kind of ordered them around. But we always enjoyed getting down on a real human level with people and making them know that we care about them. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's going to change the world, make it a better place for everybody. We enjoyed it. I mean, that became our life, is meeting people and helping to make a difference.
It's remarkable. How has it influenced your children?
Oh, I think it's greatly impacted them. The experience of us living at Koinonia, seeing a different way of life, a very meaningful, deeply religiously rooted way of life, meeting people who were, some were very different, some were really weird actually, but being able to accept everybody, no matter how different or where they came from. And then the experience overseas, the 3 years in Africa. Why our son in seminary applied for a job to work in Saudi Arabia at Aramco. He was leading the kids of Americans and Europeans in their summer activities when they were out of school. And he got that job basically because he had had international living experience. There were 3 others that applied, but he got the job because he had that. And they never meet a stranger.
Yeah.
Some of our kids have been more engaged in worthwhile church and community activities. All 4 of them are, you know, their own person, and we never have tried to force them. Mm-hmm. They've been on bills with us. They've started student habitat groups, habitat campus chapters they're called. They've been involved with the effort that we started in 2005 after we left Habitat, the Fuller Center for Housing. That's a shirt, Fuller Center for Housing. You know, we have a daughter-in-law who is actually on staff, helps raise money for the Fuller Center. They've started groups in their communities. Our daughter out in Texas, who is a home builder for very upscale housing.
Yeah.
Not like the ones that we built with Habitat in the Fuller Center, but they got her to lead a Habitat house in Denton, Texas. So they've been involved in different ways, but you know, they've had their education, their raising their families, and then they haven't done it full time, but each has done something in their own way.
Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to add?
I know there's probably
It's always hard to think of
some
everything,
stories. Yeah. Excuse me. Oh, let me just think a minute.
I'm just going to turn off.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.